Moominsummer Madness by Tove Jansson. Chapter 3. About learning to live in a haunted house. Moomin Mama was sitting on the roof with her handbag, work basket, coffee pot, and the family photograph album in her lap. Now and again she had to move a little higher away from the rising sea, as she didn't like to trail her tail in the water. Especially not when there were callers. "We simply can't take the whole drawing room suit," said Moomin Papa. "Dearest," replied Moomin Mama, "what's the use of tables without chairs, and chairs without tables, and of beds if there is no linen cupboard?" "You're right," Moomin Papa admitted. "And the mirror door's very useful," said Moomin Mama blandly. "You know yourself how nice it is to take a look in the glass in the morning. And," she continued after a while, "the couch is so nice for a quiet spell of thinking in the afternoon." "No, not the couch," Moomin Papa said determinedly. "As you think best, dear," she replied. Uprooted bushes and trees came floating along. Carts and knitting troughs, prams, fish chests, landing stages and fences sailed on, empty or fringed with house-wrecked people. We were all too small, however, as rafts for a drawing-room suit. But after a while, Moomin Papa pushed his head back and looked sharply out over the sea. Something strange was on its way, carried by the inward current. Moomin Papa had the sun straight in his eyes and couldn't tell if it was anything dangerous, but anyway it looked like a big thing, big enough to hold 10 drawing rooms and an even larger family than his. Far out, the thing had looked just like a large tin, ready to sink. Now it resembled a seashell raised on edge. Moomin Papa turned to his family and remarked, "I think they'll manage." "Of course we'll manage," replied Moomin Mama. "We're only waiting for our new home. Only bad people fare badly." "Not always," said Vomper. "I know villains who have never even fallen in the water." "What a poor life," said Moomin Mama wonderingly. Now the strange thing had drifted closer. It was quite clearly a kind of house. 2 golden faces were painted on its roof. One was crying and the other one laughing at the Moomins. Beneath the grinning faces gaped a kind of large rounded cave, filled with darkness and cobwebs. Obviously, the great wave had carried away one of the walls of the house. On either side of the yawning gap drooped velvet curtains sadly trailing in the water. Moomin Papa wonderingly stared in among the shadows. "Anybody home?" he shouted cautiously. No answer. They could hear an open door banging with the roll of the sea, and curls of dust scurried to and fro over the empty floor. "I hope they're saved," said Moomin Mama worriedly. "Poor family. I wonder what they looked like. It's really quite terrible to take their home away from them like this." "Dearest," said Moomin Papa, "the water's rising." I know," answered Moomin Mama. "I suppose we'd better move over then." She climbed over to her new home and looked around her. These people had been just a little untidy, she could see. But then, who isn't? They had saved a lot of old disused things. Pity that the wall had fallen out, but now in summertime it wasn't so very important. "Where'll we put the drawing-room table?" asked Moomintroll. "Here, in the middle of the floor," replied his mother. She felt very much more at ease when the beautiful drawing-room chairs with their dark red plush and dangling tassels were assembled around her. The strange room became cozy at once, and Moomin Mama happily seated herself in a rocking chair and started to dream of curtains and sky blue wallpaper. "Now there's only the flagpole left above water," said Moomin Papa sadly. Moomin Mama patted his paw. "It was such a nice house," she replied. "Far better than this one. But after a while you'll see that everything feels just as usual." Dear reader, Moomin Mama was totally wrong. Nothing was going to be quite as usual because the house wasn't an ordinary house at all, nor had any ordinary family lived there. I won't tell you more now. "Shall I rescue the flag?" asked Wampa. "No, leave it," said Moomin Papa. "It looks so proud." Slowly they drifted further up the Moomin Valley. When they arrived at the first pass to the lonely mountains, they could still see the flag waving a merry farewell over the water. Moomin Mama had laid the table for supper in her new home. The table looked a little lonely in the large and unfamiliar room. The chairs, the looking-glass cabinet, and the linen cupboard kept watch around it, but behind them lurked an expanse of darkness, silence, and dust. The ceiling from which the drawing-room lamp should have hung securely with its fringe of red tassels. The ceiling was the strangest of all. It was lost in mysterious moving and fluttering shadows, while something large and vague kept slowly rocking to and fro with the house's movements in the water. "There is a lot of things one can't understand," Moomin Mama said to herself. "But why should everything be exactly as one is used to having it?" She counted the teacups on the table, and then she saw that they had forgotten to bring the marmalade over to their new home. "What a shame," said Moomin Mama. "As if I hadn't known that Moomintroll loves marmalade with his tea. How could I forget? Perhaps those people who lived here before also forgot to take their marmalade with them." Womper suggested helpfully. "Perhaps it was difficult to pack, or if there was so little left in the pot, it didn't matter." "Well, if one could find it," Moomin Mama replied doubtfully. "I'll have a look," said Womper. "There must be a pantry somewhere." He made his way into the darkness. In the middle of the floor, a door stood alone by itself. Womper stepped through it just for form's sake and was surprised to find that it was made of plywood. It had a tiled stove painted on its backside. When he ascended the staircase and found that it ended in mid-air. "Somebody's pulling my leg," Womper thought. "Only I don't think he's funny. A door should lead somewhere, and a staircase too. What would life be like if a Miss Abel suddenly behaved like a mimble or a Womper like a Hamulin?" Further on he found heaps of rubbish, curious frames of plaster, plywood, and canvas, evidently broken things that the former family hadn't cared to carry up to the attic, or had started to make but never finished. "What are you looking for?" asked the Mimbles' daughter, coming out of a cupboard that had neither shelves nor back to it. "Marmalade," replied Womper. "Seems to be all kinds of things here," said the Mimbles' daughter, "so why not marmalade? Must have been a funny family. We saw one of them, said Little Ma importantly, one who didn't want to be seen himself. Where? Asked Wampa. The Mimble's daughter pointed towards a dark corner where a lot of rubbish was piled up to the ceiling. A palm was leaning against the wall nearby and melancholically rustling its paper leaves. A villain, whispered Little Mai, only waiting to knock us all over the head. Now take it easy, said Wampa with a slight catch in his throat. He approached the little door that stood ajar and sniffed carefully. It led to a narrow passage mysteriously winding on into darkness. I suppose the pantry would be somewhere in these parts, said Wampa. They entered the passage and discovered that it was lined with small doors. The Mimble's daughter peered at the nearest doorplate and spelled out the faded letters. Propertius, she read. Propertius. What a villainous name. Wampa braced himself and knocked. They waited, but evidently Mr. Propertius wasn't in. The Mimble's daughter pushed the door open. Never before had they seen so many things at one time and in one place. The walls were all shelves up to the ceiling and down to the floor, and the shelves contained all the things that can be placed on shelves. Large bowls filled with fruit, playthings, table lamps and china, tin helmets and flowers, tools and stuffed birds, books and telephones, fans and buckets, globes and guns, hat boxes and mantel clocks, and ladder scales and... Little Mai took a flying jump from her sister's shoulder and landed on one of the shelves. She stared in a mirror and cried, "Look, I'm growing smaller all the time. I can't even see myself anymore." "It's not a real looking glass," explained the Mimble's daughter. "You're here all right, life-size." Wampa hunted for marmalade. "Perhaps jam will do just as well," he said, and tried to take the lid off a jam pot. "Painted plaster," stated the Mimble's daughter. She took an apple and chewed at it. "Wood," she said. Little Ma laughed. But Wampa felt worried. All the things around him were false. Their pretty colors were a sham, and everything he touched was made of paper or wood or plaster. The golden crowns weren't nice and heavy, and the flowers were paper flowers. The fiddles had no strings and the boxes no bottoms, and the books couldn't even be opened. Troubled in his honest heart, Wampa pondered over the meaning of it all, but he couldn't find any solution. "I wish I were just a tiny bit more clever," he thought. "Or a few weeks older." "I like it here," said the Mimble's daughter. "It's just as if nothing really mattered here." "Does anything matter anywhere?" asked Little Mai. "No," her sister replied happily. "Don't ask such silly questions." At that moment somebody gave a snort, loudly and contemptuously. They looked frightenedly at one another. "I'm going back," Wampa mumbled. "All these things make me sad." A loud thump resounded from the drawing room, and a light cloud of dust rose from the shelves. Wampa snatched a sword and rushed out in the passage. They could hear Miss Bell squeaking. The drawing room was completely dark. Something large and yielding struck Wampa in the face. He closed his eyes and thrust his sword straight through the invisible enemy. There was a sharp, rending sound as if the enemy was made of cloth, and and when Whomper dared to open his eyes again, he could see daylight through the hole he had made. "What are you doing?" asked the Mimble's daughter behind him. "I've killed Propertius," replied Whomper in a trembling voice. The Mimble's daughter laughed and climbed through the hole into the drawing room. "And what are you up to here?" she asked. "Mother just pulled a rope," cried Moomintroll. "And when something terribly big fell down from the ceiling," cried Mizabel. "And all of a sudden we had a landscape in the room," said the Snark Maiden. "At first we thought it was real, until you came in through the lawn." The Mimble's daughter turned for a look. She saw a wood of very green birches by a highly colored blue lake. Whomper's face was peering out of the grass with a relieved expression. "Great goodness," Moominmama said. "I thought it was some kind of curtain string. And when all this comes sailing down, what luck nobody was hurt. Did you find any marmalade?" "No," answered Whomper. "Well, we must have some tea in any case," said Moominmama. "We can look at this picture meanwhile. It's wonderful. I hope it's going to stay where it is now." She began pouring out tea. And at that moment somebody laughed. It was a spiteful laugh that sounded immensely old, and it emerged from the dark corner behind the paper palm. "What are you laughing at?" asked Moominpapa after a long silence. The silence only lengthened. "Won't you take a cup of tea?" asked Moominmama uncertainly. The corner remained silent. "It must be someone who has lived here before us," she said. "Why won't he step out and introduce himself?" They waited a long time, but as nothing happened, Moominmama said, "Your tea is getting cold, children," and began to share out the cheese in equal pieces. Then, while she spread butter on the toast, a sudden shower of rain dropped on the roof. Just as suddenly, a gale started to whine and whistle outside. They looked out and saw the sun sinking peacefully in a summer sea, smooth as a mirror. "Something rotten here," remarked Whomper. He seemed rather upset. The gale heightened. They distinctly heard the sound of a surf breaking on a distant shore, and the rain evidently continued to pour down over their heads. But outside the weather looked just as lovely as before, and then the thunder started. At first, a quiet rumbling in the distance. Then it drew closer. White lightning flashed through the drawing room, and soon peal after peal rolled over the unhappy Moomins. The sun was still setting quietly and nicely. Then the floor began to turn around. It started off on a slow pace, but soon it went faster and faster until the tea splashed to and fro in the cups and spilled over the rims. The drawing room behaved like a merry-go-round, and the table and chairs and all the Moomins and the mirror cabinet and the linen cupboard could do nothing but hang on. In a little while everything stopped as suddenly as it had started. Thunder, lightning, rain and wind, all were gone. "What a very strange world the world is," exclaimed Moominmama. "That wasn't real," cried Whomper. "There were no clouds, and the lightning struck thrice and nothing broke. And the rain and wind and—" "Somebody was laughing at me all the time," said Mizabel. "It's all over now," said Moomintroll. "We'll have to be very careful," said his father. "This is a dangerous haunted house, and anything may happen." He looked around him with shining eyes. "Thanks for the tea," said Whomper. He walked to the edge of the drawing room and stared out in the dusk. They are all so very unlike me. He thought. They have feelings, and they see colors and hear sounds and whirl around. But what they feel and see and hear and why they whirl doesn't concern them in the least. The uppermost rim of the sun disk disappeared in the water, and at the same moment the whole drawing room was splendidly lit. In astonishment, the Moomins looked up from their cups of tea. An arc of burning lamps, red and blue, stretched above them. It framed the evening sea like a reef of stars, beautiful and friendly looking. A similar row of lamps glowed along the floor. "That's to prevent people from falling in the water," said Moomin Mama. "How orderly life can be, but all these exciting and wonderful events have made me just a little tired. I think I'll retire now." But before Moomin Mama pulled her counterpane over her snout, she remembered to say, "Still, please wake me up if anything new happens." Later in the evening, Isabel went for a solitary stroll by the sea. She saw the moon rise and started his lonesome journey through the night. "He's exactly like me," Isabel thought sadly, "so plump and lonely." At this thought, she felt so forsaken and mild that she had to cry a little. "What are you crying for?" asked a Whomper nearby. "I don't know, but it feels nice," replied Isabel. "But people cry because they feel sorry, don't they?" objected Whomper. "Well, yes, the moon," Isabel replied vaguely and blew her nose. "The moon and the night and all the sadness there is." "Oh yes," said Whomper. Chapter 4. About vanity and the dangers of sleeping in trees. A few days passed. The Moomins were beginning to get used to their strange home. Every evening, exactly at sundown, the beautiful lamps were lighted. Moomin Papa found out that the red velvet curtains could be pulled to against rain, and that there was a small pantry under the floor. It had a round little roof and was quite cool, as there was water around it on 3 sides. But the nicest discovery was that the ceiling was filled with pictures, still more beautiful than the one with the birches. You could pull them down and back up again, just as you liked. There was one picture of a veranda with a fretwork railing, and it became their favorite because it reminded them of the Moomin Valley. The whole family would have felt completely happy had it not been for the strange laugh which sometimes cut them short when they talked with each other. At other times there were just contemptuous snorts. Somebody was snorting at them but never showed himself. Moomin Mama used to fill a special bowl at the dinner table and put it by the paper palm in a dark corner, and the following day the bowl was always carefully emptied. "It's someone who is very shy," she said. "It's someone who's waiting," said the Mimbles' daughter. One morning, Isabel, the Mimbles' daughter, and the Snark Maiden were combing their hair. Isabel ought to change her hairdo, remarked the Mimbles' daughter. A parting in the middle doesn't suit her. But no fringe for her, said the Snark Maiden, and ruffled up her soft hair between the ears. She gave her tail tuft and light brushing and turned her head to see if the fluff was tidy down her back. Does it feel nice to be fluffy all over? Asked the Mimbles' daughter. Very, the Snark Maiden replied with satisfaction. Isabel, are you fluffy? Isabel didn't answer. Isabel ought to be fluffy, said the Mimbles' daughter, and began to tie her hair in a knot. Or curly all over, said the Snark Maiden. All of a sudden, Isabel stamped her feet. You and your old fluff, she cried out, bursting into tears. You know everything, don't you? And the Snark Maiden hasn't even got a frock on. I'd never show myself if I weren't properly dressed. I'd sooner be dead than have no frock on. Isabel hurried off across the drawing room and into the passage. She stumbled sobbing through the dark, and then she stopped short and felt very much afraid. She had remembered the strange laugh. Isabel stopped crying and anxiously began to feel her way back again. She fumbled and fumbled for the drawing room door, and the longer she fumbled, the more afraid she felt. Finally, she found the door and pulled it open. It wasn't a drawing room at all. It was quite another room, a dimly lighted room containing a long row of hats. Cut-off hats on long and narrow necks, with an unusual lot of hair. They were all looking towards the wall. If they'd looked at me, Isabel thought confusedly. Imagine if they had looked at me. She was so scared at first that she didn't dare to move a step. She could only stare, bewitched, at the golden curls, the black curls, and the red curls. Meanwhile, the Snark Maiden was feeling rather sorry in the drawing room. Never mind, Isabel, said the Mimbles' daughter. Anything makes her fly off the handle. But she was right, the Snark Maiden mumbled with a glance down at her stomach. I ought to have a frock. Of course not, said the Mimbles' daughter. Don't be silly. But you have one, protested the Snark Maiden. Well, that's me, said the Mimbles' daughter carelessly. Whomper, should the Snark Maiden put on a frock? If she's cold, replied Whomper. No, just anyway, explained the Snark Maiden. Or if it rains, said Whomper. But then it's more sensible to put on a raincoat. Or if it rains, said Whomper, but then it's more sensible to put on a raincoat. The Snark Maiden shook her head. For a while she hesitated. Then she said, I'll go and have this matter out with Isabel. She went for a flashlight and stepped into the small passage. It was empty. Isabel, cried the Snark Maiden in a hushed voice. As a matter of fact, I like your parting in the middle. But no Isabel answered her. Then the Snark Maiden caught sight of a streak of light at one of the doors and pattered up to it to look through the crack. In the room behind the door, Isabel was sitting all alone. She had a wholly new hair on. Long yellow corkscrew curls framed her worried face. The little Isabel stared at her reflection in the glass and sighed. She reached for another beautiful mop of hair, a red and wild one, and pulled the fringe down to her eyes. It didn't make matters better. Finally, With trembling paws, she seized the set of curls which she had laid aside because she loved them most. They were magnificently jet black, with little dashes of gold glittering like tears. Breathlessly, Isabel fitted this splendid hair over her own. For a dumb minute she looked at herself in the mirror. Then she lifted off the hair very slowly and sat staring at the floor. The Snark Maiden slipped back without disturbing her. She realized that Isabel wanted to be alone. But the Snark Maiden didn't return to the others. She went instead a bit further along the passage, sniffing the air. She had noticed an enticing and very interesting scent, a scent of face powder. The small round spot from her flashlight wandered along the walls and finally caught the magic word costumes on a door. Dresses, whispered the Snark Maiden to herself. Frocks! She turned the door handle and stepped in. Oh, how wonderful, she panted. Oh, how beautiful. Robes, dresses, frocks. They hung in endless rows, in hundreds, one beside the other all round the room. Gleaming brocade, fluffy clouds of tulle and swan's down, flowery silk, night black velvet with glittering spangles everywhere, like small many-colored blinker beacons. The Snark Maiden drew closer, overwhelmed. She fingered at the dresses. She seized an armful of them and pressed them to her snout, to her heart. The frocks rustled and swished. They smelled of dust and old perfume. They buried her in rich softness. Suddenly, the Snark Maiden released them all and stood on her head for a few minutes. To calm myself, she whispered, I'll have to calm down a bit, or else I'll burst with happiness. There's too many of them. A little before dinner, Isabel was back again in the drawing room and sat grieving alone by herself in a corner. Hello, said the Snark Maiden and sat down by her side. Isabel gave her a glance without replying. I've been looking for a dress, said the Snark Maiden, and I found several hundred and was so happy. Isabel made a sound that could have meant anything. Perhaps 1,000, continued the Snark Maiden. And I looked and tried on one after the other and felt sadder and sadder. Did you? Isabel exclaimed. Yes. What do you think? Said the Snark Maiden. They were far too many, don't you see? I couldn't ever have had them all, or even choose the prettiest. They nearly made me afraid. If there'd been only 2 instead. That'd been much easier, replied Isabel a little more cheerfully. So in the end I just ran away from them all, finished the Snark Maiden. They sat silent for a while and watched Moominsummer lay the table. Just think, said the Snark Maiden. Just think what sort of a family lived here before us. 1,000 frocks, a floor that goes around sometimes, pictures hanging from the ceiling, all their belongings on shelves in Mr. Propertius's room, paper doors and a special rain. What can they have looked like? Isabel thought of the beautiful curls and sighed. But behind Isabel and the Snark Maiden, behind the dusty rubbish by the paper palm, gleamed a pair of observant and sharp little eyes. The eyes looked at them with some disdain and then wandered over the drawing-room suit to rest at last upon Moominsummer, who was now bringing in a large dish of porridge. The eyes blackened still more, and the snout between them wrinkled with a noiseless snort. Dinner please, everybody, cried Moomin Mama. She filled the plate with porridge and sat it on the floor by the palm. The Moomins came running and sat down to dinner. Mother, began Moomin Troll and reached for the sugar. Don't you think? And then he stopped short and dropped the sugar bowl with a thump back on the table. Look, he whispered, look. They turned round and looked. A shadow detached itself from the dark corner. A grey and wrinkly shape came shuffling out, blinked in the sun, shook its whiskers and gave the company a hostile look. I'm Emma, said the old stage rat solemnly. And I'd like to tell you that I hate porridge. This is the third day you're eating porridge. We're having gruel tomorrow, Moomin Mama replied shyly. I loathe gruel, answered Emma. Won't Emma take a chair, please? Said Moomin Papa. We thought this house was deserted, and that's why the... House indeed, Emma interrupted with a snort. This is no house. She limped up to the table but didn't sit down. Is she angry at me? Whispered Isabel. What have you done? Asked the Mimbles' daughter. Nothing, Isabel mumbled to her plate. I just feel as if I had done something. I always feel as if someone were angry with me. If I were the wonderfulest Isabel in the world, everything would be different. Well, but as you aren't, replied the Mimbles' daughter and continued her meal. Was Emma's family saved? Asked Moomin Mama sympathetically. Emma didn't answer. She was looking at the cheese. She reached for the cheese and put it in her pocket. Her gaze roved on and fastened on a small piece of pancake. That's ours, cried Little Mai and landed on the pancake with a flying jump. That wasn't nice manners, said Mimbles' daughter reproachfully. She lifted her sister aside, brushed some dust off the pancake and hid it under the tablecloth. Vomper dear, Moomin Mama hastened to say, run along and look if we have something nice for Emma in the pantry. Vomper hurried off. Pantry, exclaimed Emma. The pantry indeed. You seem to believe that the prompter's box is a pantry. And the stage drawing room with the drops for pictures. And the curtains just curtains and the property's a person. She had become quite red in the face, and her snout was wrinkled up to her forehead. Really, thank goodness, she cried. Thank goodness that my beloved husband, stage manager Filijong, may he rest in peace, can't see you all. You don't know a thing about the theater, that's clear. Less than nothing, not even the shadow of a thing. There was a herring, but it's rather an old one, said Vomper, returning. Emma fiercely struck the fish from his hand and shuffled stiffly back to her corner. For a long time she kept rattling a number of things and finally pulled out a large broom and began to sweep the floor. What's a theater? Moomin Mama whispered uneasily. I don't know, replied Moomin Papa. Looks as if one ought to know it. In the evening, a strong scent of rowan tree flowers crept into the drawing room. Birds came fluttering in to hunt for spiders in the ceiling, and Little Mai met a big and dangerous ant on the rug. They had landed in a forest without anybody noticing. The general excitement was great. All forgot to be afraid of Amma and gathered talking and gesticulating by the water. They made fast the house to a big rowan tree. Mom and Papa fastened the hawser to his walking stick and pushed the stick through the pantry roof. "Don't you damage the prompter's box," Emma shouted at him. "Is this a theater or a landing stage?" "I suppose it's a theater if Emma says so," Mom and Papa replied humbly, "but none of us quite knows what that means." Emma stared at him without replying. She shook her head, shrugged her shoulders, gave a strong snort, and continued to sweep the floor. Mom and Papa was looking up into the top of a large tree. Swarms of bumblebees were humming around the white flowers. The bowl was nicely curved, forming a kind of rounded fork, exactly suited to sleep in if you were small enough. "I'll sleep in this tree tonight," said Moomintroll suddenly. "I too," said the Snark Maiden at once. "And me," shouted Little My. "We're sleeping at home," said the Mimbles' daughter. "There might be ants in the tree, and if they bite you, you'll swell up and grow bigger than an orange." "But I want to grow up. I want to grow up. I want to grow up," cried Little My. "You'd better be good now," said her sister, "or else the grog takes you." Moomintroll was still looking up at the green ceiling of leaves. It was a little like home in the Moomin Valley. He began whistling to himself while he planned the rope ladder he intended to make. Emma came running. "Stop whistling at once," she cried. "Why?" asked Moomintroll. "It's a disaster to whistle on the stage," Emma replied in a lowered voice. Not even that, do you know?" Mumbling and shaking her broom, she limped off into the shadows. The Moomins looked after her a little uneasily. Then they forgot it all. At bedtime, Moomintroll was hoisting up bedclothes into the tree. Moomin Mama was packing a small breakfast basket for Moomintroll and the Snark Maiden. It would be fun to have it when they awakened the next morning. Mizabel looked on. "How nice to be able to sleep in a tree," she said. Why don't you, if you think you'd like it?" Moomin Mama asked. "Nobody's asked me to," Mizabel said sullenly. "Dear me, take your pillow and climb up to the others, Mizabel dear," said Moomin Mama. "No thanks, it's no fun now," replied Mizabel and went away. She sat down in a corner and cried. "Why is it always like this?" she thought. "What makes everything so sad and difficult?" Moomin Mama lay awake for a long time that night. She listened to the water lapping beneath the floor and felt a bit uneasy. She could hear Emma shuffling along the walls, muttering to herself. Unknown animals were shrieking in the forest. "Moomin Papa," she whispered. Replied Moomin Papa. "I feel a bit anxious about something." "Don't bother, everything's all right," mumbled Moomin Papa and slept on. Moomin Mama lay looking into the forest for a while. But little by little she drowsed off, and night fell over the drawing room. An hour passed. Then a grey shadow crept over the floor and stopped at the pantry. It was Emma. Mastering all her aged strength and anger, she managed to pull Moomin Papa's stick out of the hole in the pantry roof. She threw stick and hawser far away out in the water. "Spoiling the prompter's box," she muttered to herself, emptied a bowl of sugar from the supper table into her pocket and returned to her corner. Freed from its moorings, the house started off with the current. For a while, the twinkling arc of red and blue lamps glittered among the trees. Then it disappeared, and only the grayish moonlight lighted the forest.